12 o'clock, so we're going to try and keep things on track here. So today it's kind of my honor and privilege to introduce our Bear Ranch Seminar speaker today. Dr. Roel Lopez is the department head for now the
Deformed, yes.
yeah, deformed, yeah.
It is a bit deformed.
Yeah, newly formed Department of Rangeland Wildlife and Fisheries Management. He's also the director of Texas A&M's Natural Resources Institute. And throughout my career, Roel has been able to play as an advisor, a mentor, a counselor, boss on various levels, and now colleague and friend. So I'm really glad to host him here today, and he's here to tell you how great Texas is, I believe. So with that, I'll let him take over.
That topic would probably not be that great of a topic, right? So that is not what I hope to do, but appreciate the first and foremost the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be back in Montana, and one of the things that's striking to me is the similarities in a lot of ways between Texas and Montana, and I'd like to kind of share some of those lessons from our perspective, and perhaps some things that in preparation for this seminar, I did a land trends analysis of Montana that I'd like to share with you, and kind of highlight some of those similarities as well as some of those differences. So online, I'm assuming you can hear me. All right. A while back, a couple of months ago, I went to a Japanese restaurant. I got a Chinese fortune cookie. Don't ask me to explain why. But the fortune in that cookie was rivers need springs. Rivers need springs. And I kind of geeked out with my wife, said, man, that's such a basic ecological, hydrological, rangeland principle and so forth. And she thought I was nuts, but I kept that fortune cookie just as a reminder of the importance of land and the importance of private land stewardship with regards to this basic premise or idea. And so what I'd like to do this afternoon is three things. Is give you an overview of some of the things that are happening in Texas with regards to changes in farms and ranches and family forests. Collectively, we call them working lands. Similarly, I want to do the same thing for Montana and kind of show some of those trends and what the implications are. Not being from Montana, this is where folks online and in the room here today are going to be helpful to me. I'll kind of give you what I think might be happening, but you can ground me and validate some of the things, or maybe correct some of the things as we go through that. And then at the end, I'd like to describe a program that we're developing in partnership with state agencies, AFWA, as well as a few university partners, to include Montana State, as a mechanism to address this idea of the importance of private lands, of farms, ranches, family forests, and how it relates back to that fortune cookie. So here's a picture taken 75 years ago. 75 years ago, this was taken, and I'd like to ask, anyone know where that photo was taken from? Any guesses? Downtown Dallas. And you can see the Omni Hotel. Those towers are now where the State Fair is and so forth. But this is literally completely changed. It's a large urban center. And I kind of wonder what the cowboy was thinking at that point in time, grazing there outside of the core area of downtown Dallas. I'd like to think that he probably had no clue. But I also would like to think that Willie the horse, who was cousin to Mr. Ed, older folks will understand that pun, probably thought, big changes are coming. And certainly they are. When you look at rangelands and you look at Texas, you look at Montana, much of our landscapes are in fact rangelands. And it's probably one of the most at-risk biomes on planet Earth, with a loss due to conversion, fragmentation in that Great Plains region that image shows you. And so one of the reasons for that is relatively flat, easy to develop, and there's typically no protection with that. And so over the years, we've seen a degradation, a conversion of those rangelands. And one of the basic drivers for this is the notion that we're basically running out of land. We have an increasing populations. And again, using Texas as an example, most of Texas are native rangelands, shortgrass prairie, tallgrass prairie, and so forth, that's threatened by this development. Texas is a large state, 171 million acres. And when you look at Texas, about 81% of the state is a farm, a ranch, a family forest, working lands. But about 19% of the state is urbanized or developed. It's in a non-agricultural use, about 139 million acres, which serves to support about 31 million Texans, 31 million Texans. Almost 90% of Texans live in an urban center. About 10% of Texans live in a rural community, and 1% of Texans steward 139 million acres. That's Aggie math if you're doing the calculations there. So 1%, about 250,000 landowners steward 81% of the land base. So from a conservation perspective, if you're going to have an impact, working with private landowners is a real key aspect to that, right? And so the situation for us is every day we're adding about 1,200 people to our state roster. Every day that 1,200 plus people results in the loss of about 1,000 acres of ranch land, of farmland in our state every day. Couple that with the fact that the average age for Texas landowners is about 65 years of age. They're approaching that or are at that retirement age. And we're seeing the largest intergenerational transfer of working lands in our state's history, in our country's history. So as I'm saying these things, think about Montana. Not a lot of differences, right? In some of those basic trends. And again, from a conservation stewardship perspective, engaging with, supporting private landowners is a key aspect. Nearly a third of these working lands by our calculations will be or are being impacted as we speak. Here's a statistic that kind of blows people's mind. I left San Antonio yesterday, and in San Antonio, we have about 3 million Texans compared to the 1.2 million Texans in the entire, or Montanians in the entire state. Okay. So those highlighted counties in Texas, which are those urban centers, the top 25 counties in terms of population density, there's more people in those 25 counties than all of those highlighted states individually. And so again, we have a fairly significant issue in terms of how do you sustain these rural landscapes and the associated public benefits that are derived from private lands moving forward. And so that's part of my message today, with the notion, and going back to Willie the horse, the notion that we have more people, we have diverse and emerging stakeholders, we have changes and impacts to our land infrastructure. That's a term I want to introduce to you, this notion that land is in fact infrastructure. When you think of rural communities, when you think of urban communities, we oftentimes think of roads, we think of power, we think of water as infrastructure. Land in itself is a form of infrastructure, an important form, right? And one of the challenges for us is competing interests. We're no longer the only horse at that trough and trying to demonstrate the value and importance of private lands. When you look at the demographics of Texas, urban versus rural, and I hate to say it that way, but there's more and more urban Texans being added to the roster at an increasing rate and a decline in rural communities. Right now, we're sitting at about 31 million Texans. That number is expected to double in the next 30 years. So Dr. Beaver was complaining to me about the traffic from Billings to Bozeman. He said, there's 3 or 4 cars in front of me. And I said, Bubba, I have 3 or 4 cars on the side of me in the highways that we're driving. And so all kidding aside, we're experiencing a lot of the same issues but they're kind of at different points in time. And so that number is going to increase. And the result is more and more of these type of signs. The fragmentation is breaking up of those farms, ranches, family forests, and ultimately converting into a non-agricultural use. So the numbers I'm going to share with you this morning or this afternoon is really focused on lands under some sort of ag valuation. So that applies to the Montana trends as well as the Texas trends. And that photo there down at the corner shows you where that cowboy was sitting there 75 years ago and the changes that have happened over the last 75 years. And one of the key drivers for changes in farms, ranches, and in the loss of working lands is population numbers. And in Texas, we've seen about a 55% population increase in the last 25 years. And those urban centers serve as anchors for that change. Texas has the dubious honor of having 8 of the 15 fastest growing cities in the country, rather. And so again, it's a pretty significant change for us. The second thing that comes with more people, greater demand on farms and ranches is the idea of market value. Market value is a very good predictor of changes in farms and ranches. And you get to the point that you just can't offset that, right? It's too much in terms of that change. That area that I showed you, I'll go back here. It's called the Texas Triangle. And over the last 25 years, it's filled in. You could see that in that map, right? That heat map at the bottom 25 years ago and where we are now. There's more people on the eastern part of I-45, which is really way over to this side, or the number of representatives in Houston alone than the rest of the state. So the political standing is very different in a state like Texas. So to give you a perspective, 20 years ago, we were losing about 62 acres a day. 5 years ago, we were losing nearly a section of land. Today, we're losing a little over 1,000 acres. So it's not even linear, it's exponential. This is to put things into football terms. So we've gone from 3 Kyle Fields to about 60 Kyle Fields, because part of the story here is also kind of helping people understand what are we really talking about. 1,000 acres a day is a pretty sizable piece of property, and we're not making any more land. And looking at those statistics, we've lost over the last 25 years about almost 4 million acres of working lands. And when I say loss, what I mean by that is fragmentation is breaking up 1,000 acres into smaller chunks. You try to hold on to as much of it, but then at some point it converts into a non-agricultural use. It's an apartment complex, it's a subdivision, etc. And I like to tell people that, what's the last crop that we're going to plant in Texas? Asphalt. It's the last crop we're going to, or concrete, if you want to use concrete, depending on what your preferred substrate is. All right, so either way, that's sort of our reality. We've lost as much in the last 5 years as the previous 20. So again, it's a pretty sizable concern. And location matters. This really, I think, hits home here in Montana. I live in Bexar County, where in the last 25 years, we lost about 1,400 acres of working lands, versus in those neighboring counties is where we're seeing the greatest change, right? And it makes sense because in town, it's already been lost. And so that pressure outside of the town is where you see the greatest change. And as you move further from those urban centers, it becomes less and less. Oh. One of the things that's interesting in Texas about in the mid 90s, we passed a law where you can maintain land under some sort of ag valuation. But in Texas, if you're managing for wildlife, you can switch from that ag valuation to wildlife. And so this map or series of maps shows you this trend in moving more and more of the objectives of those properties toward wildlife. And I'll show you some maps here in a minute comparing grazing versus wildlife. And again, I think you're probably going to see a lot of that here in Montana as well. in looking at the breakdown in operation size between 25 years ago to today, about 47% 25 years ago of that 250,000 landowners were less than 100 acres. So small acres really was a small aspect or a big aspect of, if you will, of that land base, and that's increased over the last 25 years. We're sitting at about 60%. And looking at the number of acres in working lands, number of acres, this is a little different. As expected, the number of acres by operation size is bigger and bigger operations. You sum up those bigger operations, of course, they're going to be 61 to now 70%. But then when you look at that 3% or 4% on this deal, 4% of landowners steward 70% of the land. So those bigger operations, there are fewer of them. There's about 10,000 landowners that fit that category, as opposed to 60%, which only steward about 3%. That's kind of a challenge for us, right? I think of Eastern versus Western Montana, right? How do you sort of steward or work or interact with landowners in the Western part as opposed to the Eastern part, just because of the differences in size, goals and objectives, things of that sort. So one of the things that we've seen, and we've tracked this, I call this land trends, Texas land trends, and we've done this for the last 20 plus years and looking at those changes over time. And we marry a couple of different data sets. And so in looking at landowner demographics, which are a key piece of this, we see that for the first time, the average age of landowners actually decreased. And part of the reason is that transition's been happening for a decade. And so the average is beginning to pull down. But again, the question then becomes, what's that future landowner going to look like? What are their goals and objectives? They, in fact, have different goals and objectives. They're less tied to the land. Absentee ownership for us is about a third, 33%. That's increased or decreased rather by 2 to 3%. Part of the reason is COVID. We've learned that we could telework. We could live on a family farm or ranch and so forth. The years of experience is about a third are new to the land, if you will. And we've seen an increase in that same time period as well. So again, I think this starts to kind of make sense. As I'm kind of going through the Texas statistics, I see a lot of nodding heads. It's like, yep, okay. That I like to tell people, I'm not going to tell you anything you didn't already know. I'm just kind of showing you numbers to sort of validate, okay, that makes sense and why we're seeing that. In addition to collecting data on rural land, we also collect data with landowners via a 5-year landowner survey to marry with our Ag Census data and some other comptroller data and so forth that we use that collectively define land trends. And the question that we've asked in the last 15 years, every 5 years, has resulted in the same top 3 or 4. You know, why do you own land? Hunting, wildlife, family. And that hasn't changed. That's a big driver. I bet if we were to ask Montana landowners, there's going to be some similar patterns there. And it may vary based on where you are in the state as well. So if I'm losing 1,000 acres a day of a farm and ranch, and I believe that there's value to a farm and ranch in terms of the public benefits, what are the consequences of that? This is where I think we need to start to get better in telling our story. So the consequences in Texas of losing 1,000 acres of ranch is the inability to produce 31 steak dinners over a year's time. Last crop, remember? So I'm taking that beef input out of the picture. The inability to produce fiber for 16,000 blue jeans. And lastly, the inability to fill 142 water towers. I use those statistics because it helps us and tell the story. There's some consequences to losing private lands. And those benefits go beyond the operator, the landowner. It benefits people in cities and people in suburbs and so forth. And so that's part of, I think, the conversation that we're beginning to see with regards to private lands, private land stewardship, is this question of what's the value of land? What's the holistic value of land? I was talking to Rachel earlier, and we were talking about ecosystem services and these public benefits. And we're beginning to sort of discover and understand and try to characterize that broader and more complete picture. Because without that, you can't push back on the tsunami, the wave of change that's coming to us, right? It at least starts that conversation. And so that's one thing I like to convey to students is the ecosystem services. That's the definition. Contributes benefits to human. What nature provides us for free. Is it really free? There's a landowner that stewards those properties to the benefit of those public benefits, right? And so it's not really free. And one of the things we've attempted to do in Texas, and those are some examples of the kinds of reports that we've worked on, is trying to understand what is the value, the total value of ecosystem services, the value of hunting. The value of hunting in Texas collectively is a $9 billion a year industry. It's a big business. It's a real big business. I bet if I were to do the same thing for Montana, elk and deer and other forms of wildlife and hunting enterprises would be pretty significant as well. And so that's part of the I think strategy is to really convey this idea that stacking matters from a conservation perspective, trying to better understand the holistic value. And this was our attempt to do that initially. Is it perfect? No, but it starts that conversation. So because of that report, now we've been able to increase the amount of dollars for land conservation in the state, and that has served us well in that regard. So this is a graph I was talking about earlier. This is an interesting map where I've talked about wildlife valuation, how that's increased. The map to the left shows you the average hunting to grazing lease, and it, as a ratio. The hotter the color, that basically means I could make more money from wildlife than traditional grazing. It's not to say the two don't go hand in hand. They're both important. The cow is a tool, right, in the work that we do. But it does start to point out that this more comprehensive look, the value of land, is important as part of the conservation strategy, in my opinion. And it's not surprising that western part of the state is gravitating toward wildlife because it's easier to make a living from a landowner perspective. It's easier to sustain wildlife as opposed to beef cattle production. We're also beginning to see the attempts to value other services, whether it be endangered species or biodiversity. I know there's been a lot of effort with carbon markets. In my opinion, I think the likely most important market long-term is going to be biodiversity. And so how can we get ahead of the curve and start to understand, operationalize, measure, and try to operationalize how we can do that? I shared this with Dr. Beaver, just as two examples of ecosystem services. How many people have heard of HipCamp? A few people. Jared had never heard of it before. It's kind of like the Airbnb for camping. And I brought up Montana and that Paradise Valley. So, man, it's everywhere. Okay, so that's an example of how landowners are beginning to think creatively and innovatively. And Rachel, this is what we were talking about, this idea of stacking and so forth. There's an app called Explore Ranches where you can rent a ranch for an experience. So much like an Airbnb, but it's ranches, and it could be anything from camping on the banks of a river to something that's a little bit more sophisticated. So in summarizing Texas land trends, big changes are coming. More people results in greater demand on our land infrastructure, on our natural resources, water in particular. There's changes in landowner perspectives, and collectively, this is going to require that we look at things in a more innovative, different way, and ultimately communicating the public benefits of private lands. So if I had a bumper sticker for you today, that would be it. How do we communicate the public benefits of private lands? All right, so let's pivot to Montana. let's look at what Montana kind of looks like. And so I'm going to go through this, and I want to offer a caveat. This is something I did just because I thought it would be an interesting comparison and way to sort of see what I just described in Texas is happening in a lot of other states, including Montana. There may be some different drivers, different points of reference in terms of that change, but nonetheless, they're different, right? Or there's some similarities, I should say. And so I'm going to ask you guys as I go through this, more of a conversation. I may give you an interpretation from a remote sensing perspective to help ground me. And does that make sense or not? All right. So this is a land cover, generally semi arid rangelands to the east. As you move up, increase in elevation, you get into forest lands and so forth, right? So population for Montana, about 30 plus years ago, we were about 800,000. We're topping about 1.2. So the increase from a percentage perspective is about 35, 40%. Not too far from the Texas one. The baselines are just different, right? But again, the rate of growth is pretty amazing, or rapidly growing, if you will. These two graphs show you a couple of things. The one to the left shows you population change over the last 25 years. Those highlighted blue counties is where we've seen the greatest increase percentage-wise. I see a lot of nodding heads. Starts to make sense, right? The one on the right shows you that population change. Here's the difference. The one to the left is the numbers. The one to the right is percentage-wise, okay? So again, it's just two different ways of seeing that. All right, so I want to look at changes in development, urban development over the last 20 years using the NLCD data. And so just to make it pop, that development change in the last 20 years is there in red. You start seeing those urban centers, you see those interstates, you see riparian areas and so forth. It starts to kind of make sense. That drive from Billings to Bozeman this morning, I wanted to sort of validate myself or validate that trend in my mind. And I started saying, okay, so the railroad, the interstate, the river, and it's kind of meandering along, and you can see all of those changes here on this map. The one thing where Montana is different than Texas is obviously about a third of the state is public land. And that blue area plus those green areas show you where there's lands under conservation. If you could view public land as being conserved, as well as conservation easement lands. And that kind of shows you what that looks like. Marry it with that land cover type. And let's marry the two. This is when it, to me, gets really interesting, right? You see that urban development, but then you see those pockets, like that area in Missoula, that interstate going south of town. You see the Billings and Bozeman, the gateway into onto Yellowstone and things of that sort. So, any thoughts? Does that surprise folks? I think it's being able to start to see those trends that it becomes pretty interesting, and so forth. So let's dig a little deeper. This is looking at changes in acreage by operation size, okay, for the last 25 years. And those are standard categories that we use. And what this graph tells me is, and we see this in Texas, we see some consolidation or some increases in larger operations, but we've seen a loss in those mid-size operations. This is where we in Texas see some of that. What's interesting to me is on the small acreage, you don't really see that pop. This is acres change, right? So there's fragmentation occurring, but then some of those small acres move out of working lands. And as a result, the delta is nearly flat. Look at this one that shows the number of operations, okay? So the number of operations for those 2,000, 5,000, 100 to 500 have decreased. We've seen an increase in the number of smaller operations. So the number of operations have increased, but then the number of acres have flipped. You follow me? By the way, I'm going to share these slides with folks, and you're welcome to use them as you see fit and so forth. I think part of our reason for being here is telling the story. How can we start to move the needle in terms of that? So this also is unusual compared to Texas, where we've seen the average farm size increase. And it's due to that consolidation. That consolidation tends to be on the eastern part of the state, which is kind of interesting as well, right? And so let's look at that in two forms. Small farms. So small farm acres have decreased in the last 5 years, about a 27,000 acre loss. The number of small farms have increased over the last 25 years. And this is kind of a side by side, right? So where you see that change is that Missoula, that eastern part of the state. You guys see where it gets darker? It's again a 25% decrease. We also see this area here, Paradise Valley, that strip that we drove this morning as an area of change as well. Look at the farm, large operations greater than 2,000 acres. It's a flip where the larger operations are in the eastern part, but then you start to see consolidation kind of up in this part of the world. You see that? Which is kind of interesting to me, where you've seen some losses and consolidation. The number of operations have increased, and it's probably due to that consolidation part of it. It could be corporate farms, ranches. I don't know. So if I'm way ahead of my skis, you guys tell me. But that's some of the things that I see from the data for Montana. A consolidation of small farms into larger ones on the eastern part of the state, conversion of small farms to develop. That's the key takeaway that I kind of get from the data. Make sense to you guys? A lot of nodding heads? Okay, so I'm not too far out. Absentee versus resident. Rachel and I were talking about this earlier. We couldn't go back that far. The data weren't available for Montana, but generally absentee, and that's defined very loosely, right? It could be a person that spends part-time, maybe weekends, etc. But it is about 24% currently. So that hasn't really changed much over the last 25 years. So to sort of wrap that part of it up, you know, the two photos here, the two pictures are to convey this to my fellow Montanians that it could be worse. I showed you Texas. There's some pretty significant challenges, but there's some things that are happening in the state, as many of you are aware, that we're going to have to, we collectively, you collectively will have to try to address in the upcoming years. All right. So I'm going to pivot to my last topic here, doing good on time. So one of the things that we started about 3-4 years ago in addressing this, and it's just a small way of addressing it. You know, there's some other strategies that we need to look at, is the development and operationalizing a private land stewardship academy. I want to kind of walk you through what that is, what that looks like, and what the drivers are. I think I've made the case, whether it's in Montana or whether it's in Texas, that working lands are undergoing rapid changes, right? And couple that with changes in landowner demographics, new to the land, or folks that are absentee or what have you. And there's also differences when it comes to the proportion of public land and private land. So not all approaches and so forth are the same. And so I think there's a need to sort of start to understand private land stewardship within that context. I've used the next slide often. I've never had the opportunity to use it with the right audience. And the question is, well, but Lance, let me finish. So what's the image that we have of private landowners? And this is the image, right? That's conveyed. And so one of the drivers for us and so forth is that's obviously not an accurate depiction. That's Hollywood depiction, right? But there's really a need to inform and inspire the value of private lands and private landowners, and to create a dialogue of private land stewardship. And so this academy was an attempt to do that. And we started with a book, classic academic, right? So your solution to all this, you're going to write a book. We wrote a book in a way to sort of curate information nationally to look at the trends. So some of the things I shared with you with Montana, we did that regionally for the United States to just understand what's happening to our private lands in terms of land uses, landowner demographics, and how can we kind of capture some of the basic strategies and approaches to improve the continued and sustainable use of private lands moving forward. And I would suggest to you that there's a literacy issue with regards to some of those target audiences in terms of our academy. Students, undergrad, graduate, beginning professionals, and of course, new landowners. And I'll kind of walk you through, and I'm going to use us as an example. Texas A&M has one of the largest College of Ag and Life Sciences, right? And when you look at the fall location for students at A&M in the College of Ag and Life Sciences, they primarily come from urban centers. Almost 65-70% of our students come from urban centers. They may not have a connection to, or the connection, Rachel brought up a real good point, maybe 2-3 generations ago, right? But there's not a direct connection necessarily. But when you look at my department, Rangeland, Wildlife, and Fisheries Management, that trend is even more pronounced. And so if we're preparing students for natural resource, wildlife careers, rangeland careers, animal science, how can we expect them to be able to connect with those critical producers? If you buy into the notion that private landowners and private landowner engagement is important in terms of the stewardship and conservation, we need to do a better job in addressing the literacy issue. We can't assume that, well, they'll figure it out. You may not open that gate the second time, right? And so that's part of the driver for us in trying to develop this academy. And it did start with this book, but the idea was to develop an online as well as a field course and set of courses related to the art and science of private land stewardship. And that was something that we started now 3 years ago. We've had recent conversations with AFWA, the Association for Fish and Wildlife Agencies, that represent all of the Texas Parks and Wildlife, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks type of organizations. And so they endorsed this project, and we're working to develop this online curriculum for students that would like to have a deeper understanding of private land stewardship via this academy. So it did start with this book, and those are some of the topics. And there's a lot of good stuff on private land stewardship out there, but it really hasn't been curated in maybe a way from a classic textbook kind of thing. And so those were some of the topics, and more specifically, there's 16 modules that we kind of focus on. And this book is not a Texas-focused book. It's actually a national-focused book. We have authors from various university programs, including Dr. Beaver, that serve to sort of expand this idea of addressing this literacy issue with regards to private lands and private land conservation and so forth. And so through that, the idea is to develop resources that could be used by university programs, that could be used by extension specialists, that could be used by state agencies, etc. And the way I would describe a module, those 16 different topics, is through a reading, through a TED Talk-like effort, through a live panel discussion of experts across the United States, through other supporting material that could be tailored to a given university program. So we're trying to develop basic resources that then could be tailored to students at Montana State or to producers at Montana and beyond. Does that make sense? And so that's kind of where things are working. And thinking about those three audiences, right? Undergrad, grad students, natural resource professionals, small acreage, new landowners. The idea is with those modules, there could be certificates that are offered at the university that chooses to participate. It could be through AFWA or NRCS. We're kind of working through those mechanics now. It could be a land steward certificate of some sort that also could be managed by either the partnership or through AFWA. And the delivery could be a 3-hour course, the standard 3-hour course that you would teach in a given semester. It could be compressed. That's one reason we wanted to kind of keep a lot of it under some sort of DE online kind of mechanism to just offer those flexibilities. You can create a new syllabus that kind of picks and chooses the things that maybe you want to emphasize for your given workshop, things of that sort. And the idea is to also have a field component. So when we think of the certificate, it could be the online portion of it, but then at Texas A&M and with our students in our department, there could be a 2 to 3 day field workshop. We collectively call those field institutes. That could be determined by the partner in different ways, but that would be an opportunity for them to kind of meet, on the ground with landowners and professionals to reinforce some of those basic theoretical concepts, if you will. It could be an existing agency workshop. So part of what started this is Texas Parks and Wildlife has a new biologist workshop. It's like a 2-day workshop. And so the idea with the academy is they can get some of the basic background to what's a private landowner. Texas is 97% privately owned. So if you're going to have any kind of impact conservation wise, you're working with a private landowner. And so that's a state agency. The work that we do from an extension perspective is geared very much toward that. And so then that agency workshop could complement that, right? And lastly, in Texas, we have quite a few new landowners, small acres landowners, and we have an extension program called Generation Next. It kind of helps in that transfer of that family farm ranch into the next generation. And so that's also a 2-3 day program. And so the module from the academy could be paired with that. And the idea is through time, we could have a menu of different items that are tailored for certain states or partners that have that interest. I mentioned the partners. This started with a multi-university course offered at 6 plus universities. Our thinking is we would have university partners. Those are the partners that are listed there. For now, we're starting the conversation. We've started the conversation with those. They're on board, and how that looks in terms of a certificate or the level of participation to be determined from that partner. Right? We're just trying to move the needle with that. Other universities have already expressed a keen interest in coming on board, and so at some point you have to kind of move forward. And so these are kind of our founding partners. Montana State is a key founding partner. That's one reason I'm here. I wanted to just meet with you and not only tell you some of the challenges we're experiencing in Texas, but what are some of the opportunities in us working together through this program. The other universities would be referred to as affiliates is kind of our thinking, because at some point you just have to make some decisions and move forward. This is a program that's being supported and funded by AFWA. One of the things we're currently doing is trying to raise an endowment to, my end goal is to make the cost for the academy as little as possible. The book and the maintenance of the system costs money, but we're looking at endowing the program where we would have annually, and meeting with the donor here soon, and he's interested in doing this, is funding 400 scholarships for students. So students here at Montana State would be given a scholarship as being a partner, and it wouldn't cost you anything. And how you do that, it could be outside of a university program. It could be married to existing curricula, kind of up to you guys. And we could talk more about that and what that looks like. To me, the benefits of this approach is training the next generation. The next generation is in this room here. I told you some of the issues and things that are on the horizon, right? You guys are going to address that. I'm not going to be around much longer. I'll be moving to Montana and I'm just buying a piece of property and having a chicken or two, that type of thing. But no, all kidding aside, training the next generation, communicating the benefits of private land stewardship, and probably most importantly is creating a national dialogue. And this academy surprisingly has begun to do that. There's been a strong interest again, and AFWA really has helped. That affiliation and relationship with AFA, just because they represent quite a few state agencies, all 50 for the state. All right, so big changes are coming. I'm going to wrap it up here on time, 45 minutes. I told Jared I'd hit 45 minutes. The more people, that impacts our land infrastructure. I think I've made the case for that. And there's changes in landowner perspectives that we have to address and accommodate in our programming and how we address that, right? I think when you think about private land conservation, we need to think outside the box. The business as usual is not going to work. How we do our programming and engage with landowners and so forth, looking at innovative markets or market-based approaches and so forth, and really communicating the public benefits of private lands. I always end a presentation with that bullet. To me, that's probably the most important bullet and part of our story. How can we make that change? I go back to that fortune cookie. Rivers need springs. Rivers need springs. And, you know, sometimes sequels to movies are just as good as the first movie and so forth. Star Wars and The Godfather and Rocky, right? I go back to that Japanese restaurant, looking for that Chinese fortune cookie and thinking, will I get a sequel to that faithful message? And what would it say? What would be the second? Springs need land. Rivers need springs. Springs need land. And if there was a third, it would be, and land needs stewards. Those are the three basic ecological principles for our class today. Albeit corny, I thought it worked pretty well. So with that, I do want to say thank you. It's been a pleasure being here. I've enjoyed my visits and looking at the beautiful state of Montana, but also understanding some of the challenges and changes that you're going to be experiencing. Much of what I just shared with you from a land trends perspective is available on that first website. And if you want to learn more about the Institute, you can go to that second website. And as I mentioned, I'll be happy to share those images with you. There's some, if you get the PDF, you'll get some bonus slides. So these are some slides with ownership patterns by farm size, number of producers, absentee versus resident, by type of land use, et cetera, et cetera. So there's other slides that I'll throw into the mix there. So with that, thank you. Any questions, comments? Agree, disagree on the trend. You don't have to agree. I don't know. There's some, I'm not sure why certain areas are consolidated and so forth. You guys would know that. I know I talked to Jared a little bit about that, and one of the things we talked about is maybe doing a deeper dive and just trying to understand. This was just kind of a quick analysis, but I think you could do a deeper dive to try to understand what that means from a programming perspective and so forth. Half of the challenge to addressing private land fragmentation and conversion is knowing what's coming, where it's coming, how it's coming, what's driving it, that type of thing. And that's how we've used that type of information, not only in preparing the next generation, but also in understanding how to better program and so forth. So with that, any thoughts, questions? Yes, sir.
Jeremy. My name is Jesus. I'm an extension of Forge. And so everything you talk about in the course you're talking about, I feel like I teach that course about 3 times a week on the phone and through 7 different emails. And so I've been milling over and trying to figure out a way of teaching that to a larger audience once, twice, 3 times a year. And so the comment is, I got another meeting I got to run to. So how do I get? Are you the contact?
Yeah. So
okay.
for right now, we've been talking how to illustrate that from an extension standpoint. With Lance, and we mentioned it before, and meeting with Jennifer, could it be a formal component within, the university itself, within the extension component? Those are the conversations we're having. Sure. Right now, and so that's part of it. Is what's the interest, and would you like to be a part of that?
I would.
Well, and I don't want to suggest that this cookie's been completely cooked. We have to start somewhere, and so we're kind of combining that. And what we hope to do is just being able to offer that resource so that it could be used for a private landowner type of workshop as a pre-work or homework, that type of thing. But your input in terms of sample producers and all that's part of that whole panel discussion as well. And so I'm going to use, if I could be so bold, let's say Montana State decided to offer a 3-hour course. The thinking is that first, typical 3-hour course, maybe 2 days a week, an hour and a half, right? And so maybe Tuesday is reviewing that information, but then Thursday could be that kind of conversation with producers specific to Montana or different professionals to, again, just sort of enhance and regionalize it. You can't do this at a national scale and expect to convey everything that students need to know. It's just a starting point. And so we're hoping that the Academy gives us a platform to be able to do that, but then professionals can fill in and add to that. Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, with 4-H or FFA, animal science is alive and well, but is there a way to make your science
Well,
attractive to co-teamers?
So I spoke with Dr. Frost before, and we were talking about that very thing. And one of the challenges for that is you look at where students come from, and then you look at words, right? And so we have an ecology and conservation biology. So kids coming from an urban center, they want to be a wildlife vet, they go to animal science, they go to ecology, conservation biology, they quickly find out, boy, I don't necessarily want to do this. Any wildlife vet hope of a future? Then I want to say something that may burst your bubble. The reality is the placement of students in a vet program is 10 to 15%. So they quickly figure that out. And so how do we get ahead of the curve and describe that? For us, identical. What you're experiencing in Montana, we're experiencing as well. And how do you convey that? Most of our students are in the wildlife track. We have a single degree, 5 tracks, rangeland, wildlife, aquaculture, fisheries, natural resource management, and policy. So it's more of a policy type track. And then the last one is a new track in outdoor enterprise management. So it's real similar to what Dr. Frost's program is, I would argue. It's understanding that there's stewards, landowners that are looking at the stewardship, the management of lands in a more holistic way. And so we're kind of hoping that track brings in, and it actually marries courses from 3 different departments: hotel and hospitality management, ag eco, business, finance, and natural resources. It kind of makes sense, right? I think. And I think that's what the ranching systems program is an example of that. A long-winded set of opinions and so forth, but it's hard because I think of the labels. We don't want to lose who we are and so forth. So do you change the label just to sort of capture a larger piece when in reality is we're rangelands? We went through this reorganization process. I'll share something that I find that I think you may find interesting. So I'm a wildlife professor. I've been at A&M for about 30 years, and the debate of the name of the department, that happens every university program. And I actually advocated for it being named rangelands. And the reason I did that is if you're in the wildlife business, you've got to understand rangelands and plants. It starts there. That's our currency, right? And so it may not appeal to broad students and so forth, but that's on us. And we just have to do a better job in catching them early and describing this is what this is. And so I'm afraid to do that in Texas, but I told Rachel I'd be happy to come to her class and kind of lay out the reality of things, you know, for students in animal science or what have you, saying, hey, if this may be the area and emphasis that you're interested in, not so much animal science, but some of these other programs, because again, animal science is a key part of it as well. So thanks for the question. Yes, sir.
Programs like NSF.
Boy, that's it's not an unfair question. That's a good question. And I was asked that question by students in our department. That's an unfair question. I'm like, the reality? Yeah. The reality is we're going through some pretty significant changes, right? And I don't want to get in trouble, but I'll probably get in trouble. I'm known for that. I think we're going to have to sort of muddle through that and so forth. And I'd like to think that there's a little bit of backtracking in some regards. We're beginning to see that. Initially, they went in and froze. And most of our funding comes from federal programs. They froze a lot of it, but now they're unfreezing things and so forth. The pattern that I'm seeing, which I think is pretty interesting, it's two things. The first is kind of recasting things. I'll be honest with you. Don't know you, but I'll be real honest with you. A lot of the proposals, projects we put in, we integrated climate change and all that because we were told to, right? That was the emphasis of the day of that administration. Now we're being told, take that out. All right. What are we really talking about? We're talking about resiliency. We're talking about stewardship. There's buzzwords like regenerative and things of that sort, but that's really what we're talking about is just good land stewardship. And so I think at the end of the day, that's gonna fare well. And most of the programs that are geared toward producers and so forth are being reoperationalized. So I don't know if that's a good answer for you, but I think we're going to work through it. But I think that's a fair question, and it's a fair question for our professionals. I mentioned those 5 tracks. That 4th track really had a strong agency emphasis. I mean, NRCS is just looking for rangeland specialists, and our tracks are very similar to yours, where the wildlife track follows the 486 series, the rangeland track follows the 454 series, and so forth. Fisheries, same thing. And the reason we do that is we're trying to give our students every edge they have, every advantage. This department's doing the same thing. I saw that in the curriculum and certification and so forth. What your thoughts are on certification, I'll give you my opinion. I'm a very opinionated person. I think it's important because it really shows a commitment and it really gives students the technical expertise that they want. But I think it's going to be challenging in this day and age with the shifts that we're seeing because there's a lot of people now available for employment, and so the part of the answer I told the students that day in the class of 60 people that asked that question was, I think we need to start looking at these alternative opportunities. And there's a lot of things out there, industry, NGOs, things of that sort. And this is being recorded. Thank you to, oh man, that's perfect.
Yeah. I had a couple comments online that they were excited to hear about the outdoor enterprise track, that they're in the ag tourism specialist for Montana, and so that was a benefit for them.
Yep. So there's that's kind of a new track for us, and there's 2 university programs that have something similar. Kansas State has a wildlife enterprise system, and then Auburn has a wildlife enterprise. We took the same approach, but we just made it a little broader, just because in Texas I kind of glossed over some of that, but we've got ranches that specialize in birding and stargazing, things of that sort. So yeah. So the one of our new professors is from Kansas State, and he was part of that program at Kansas State. So it's been a good thing. So
Well, with that, we'd like to thank you, Roel.
yeah, thank you.
Any of the students back home?